One of the other big stories now today is that online trolls could face 2 years in prison for sending messages or posting content. This is really important, really interesting. That causes psychological harm under new legislation targeting, quite rightly, online hate. Now, ministers will overhaul the communication laws by creating new offences in the forthcoming online safety bill. This has been created with the Culture, Media and Sport Department. The Law Commission made some recommendations. They've decided to put this forward. I'm not quite sure how you define psychological harm. I don't know how far you can go. I'm not even sure too much about what will happen. So we've grabbed a very powerful voice in this. Daniel Pryor from the Adam Smith Institute knows all about online hate. Daniel, good afternoon. Welcome to Talk Drive. How are you?
Afternoon. Pleasure to be on. Doing very well, thanks.
Thank you for taking the time. I've said before, I don't do any of that. I'm too busy with 57 children and everything in my life. But we read more and more and more and more, all of us, that online hate is out of control. I've always said, and I'll be straight with you, that if you put yourself out there, you're going to be criticised. Just don't read it. But we're now talking about kids who are bullied at school, kids who take their lives, kids who are self-harming. We're talking about people in the workplace who end up feeling so affected by this sort of online bullying from behind a computer screen that psychologically it's destroying lives. What does this new bill mean in its entirety, Daniel?
Well, I certainly agree. A lot of those things are serious problems with the online world at the moment. The problem is that this current new proposals basically mean that everything you say online, even in private chats, could be criminalized on the basis that a likely audience could be psychologically harmed. There's a lot of terms that need a lot of clarification there, and they currently don't really have them. The main thing that this does is that it shifts the onus away from what people actually say, the content of their speech online, and instead onto how people might feel about it. So you can put various protections in place, as these new proposals do, like saying, oh, the psychological harm has to be intended and it can't be in the public interest. But I still think this is very worrying stuff. You've got the threat of up to 2 years in prison in the back of your mind if you're thinking about, say, posting a tweet that might cause some conceivable group of people.
So you think this is too strong, or you think this is not, in a way, it doesn't make out what's good and what's bad? It's too general. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's the big problem with it. It basically opens up a whole host of different things that people could use to silence other people's speeches because it's not been clarified, it's not been defined enough. And it empowers people to really use the threat of criminal law to silence the opinions of those that they disagree with.
We're all into opinions, but you would agree, I'm sure, that so much damage is done by online hate. That is a fact. And there will be other people listening to this, Daniel, who would say, why has this taken so long? I have a very strong view about people who, you know, I've said it before, everybody's entitled to their opinion. But when it gets to a point where the people receiving this are affected, whether they take their own lives or self-harm or turn to drink or drugs or whatever it is, that's not right, pal. That's not right at all. And maybe the other side to the argument with you is that the threat of jail will make people think twice. Why don't you see it from that point of view, to be fair?
Well, I think we've already got laws on the books in terms of grossly offensive or, you know, potentially offensive tweets that people can be put in prison for. The problem with these new changes that it shifts the onus onto how people feel about it rather than what any sort of reasonable person might expect to be criminalized. So let's say I'm a Christian offended by Richard Dawkins, or I'm an atheist offended by some Christian viewpoint, for example. I might think that this new law would be a good opportunity to try and silence the people I dislike, or at least scare them into silence. It's not a question of, well, of course, these sort of things that you mentioned, they should be criminalized. A lot of things.
It's just the differentiation, right? And your concern is that this could just be used almost, if you like, in another way to control this woke world we now live in. You can't do this, you can't say that. I've always believed that the online abuse thing as well. I mean, you know, people will say it's the government's fault. Well, surely it's about education. And I always have, and listen, I'm not any good with computers either. In fact, I'm rubbish, which is probably one of the reasons. But shouldn't it start at home? Shouldn't you educate your own kids? Shouldn't you be teaching your kids what's right and wrong? Not just in schools or by the government. Shouldn't it start in the family unit?
Yeah, I certainly think that's a big part of it, taking some responsibility to educate your children about that sort of thing. But you mentioned that the free speech point, and this is what really got me this announcement today, the kind of hypocrisy of, on the one hand, you've got Tory ministers very recently defending Professor Kathleen Stock and her right to free speech on gender identity issues, whilst effectively making a law that ends up promoting cancel culture and criminalise people who offend others. So it seems like the government's approach isn't really as joined up here as it should be. And there's also this provision in these new proposals about specifically banning pile-ons. So, you tweet something that people don't like, 1,000 people come into your Twitter mentions or Facebook comments and say, you're a terrible person. That's going to be banned. I think that's a little bit too far. It's not fun. I've been piled on before, and it's.
I bet you've never been piled into experience. Like I've been piled into.
No, I'm sure I can't compete with
but
you
it's
on
like,
that
no,
one.
but I literally, and you'll think I'm making this up. I'm not. They laugh at me every single day. I don't do Twitter and I don't do Facebook. I haven't got enough time. The fact is, if you put yourself out there, you're going to be criticised, and you'd be pretty damn naive to think that you wouldn't be. And I think there comes a point with that. I tell the story about having dinner with somebody famous some years ago, and he sent out a tweet saying he was having dinner with me, and then he got a beer and he got really upset. And I'm like, you've invited that. If you can't handle it, get out the kitchen. My belief is that I think I agree with you in terms of how you measure the psychological harm, because if there is definitive proof, then it's absolutely right and proper that that person is prosecuted. But then you muddy the waters and you think, well, you can say, well, that really affected me when it perhaps wasn't, if they're out to, I don't know, it's difficult, isn't it? But I suppose my overall view when I read it today was that at least they're trying to do something about it initially.
Yeah, I accept that it's good that they're trying to do something. My worry is that the cure will end up being worse than the problem in this particular case. So again,
what would you do? What would you do, Daniel? How would you deal with it?
Well, first off, I'd try and fund the police better to focus on these sort of issues more broadly, because right now it seems like their priorities are on investigating, at least, even if not prosecuting people for perfectly legal speech in many cases, where the focus should be. And I think that police should devote a lot more resources into this, is really going into and actively investigating those cases of serious criminal activity online that this bill is aiming to tackle. The whole problem that I see with a lot of the discourse around online harms that we've seen in recent years is that we already have laws on the books for the vast majority of these offences. It's not that we need new laws, it's that we need the current laws to be enforced properly, rather than creating this new system that ends up catching a lot of, perfectly legal speech in it as well. So we don't want to undermine free speech whilst we're focusing on this issue. And my worry is that the government doesn't really recognise that.
Interesting. Listen, thank you, Daniel. Daniel Pryor, head of programmes at the Adam Smith Institute, talking about the government's new online safety bill.